This is Mitchell Dye with Mitchell's Front Page, live from Torquay on 94.7 The Pulse.
This morning we are at Cafe Cobo in Torquay. It's great to be here for another broadcast on 94.7 The Pulse, and there's lots to talk about today. First up, we're catching up with the Swimming Pool and Spa Association of Victoria in relation to legislation about pool fencing. They've accused the government of allowing children to remain at risk, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Brendan Watkins, the CEO. Brendan, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. Why do you say that the Victorian government is allowing children to remain at risk on pool fencing?
Look, I should be clear. It is a little technical, but in brief, what the government is talking about releasing is new legislation on the 18th of this month to say that everybody requires a standardised piece of fencing legislation, which is commonly known as the four-sided pool barrier legislation, which enforces everybody that has a safe, compliant pool to change their fencing arrangements. Whilst it's an interesting move, there's no evidence that improves safety outcomes for toddlers. What the association has been lobbying for is mandatory barrier inspections. So every 3 or 4 years, somebody goes out and inspects. A building surveyor inspects all the pool fences to make sure they're safe. That's what the vast majority of Australia does. So in Queensland, New South Wales and Western Australia, that regime has been in place for several years. In Western Australia, it's been running the longest, since 1992. They've had an 80% reduction in fatalities. In Queensland, they've had a 50% reduction in toddler fatalities. The only empirical measurement of success is mandatory barrier inspections, and the government isn't doing that.
So just to be clear, can you explain what people would have to change their fences from now to when you say that everyone would have to change their pool barriers as a result of this legislation?
Well, look, again, it's reasonably technical, but in a nutshell, what it means is prior to May 2010, the back of the house could be included as a part of the barrier. So there was a three-sided barrier, and the back of the house was included. And so the back of the house had to have windows that wouldn't open more than 100 mil and doors that would self-close and lock to keep the kids out of the pool. After May 2010, they've gone to what's known as four-sided safety barriers. So if this legislation gets through, it will generally be the case that people will have to put a fence between the pool and the house and no longer use the house as a barrier. So really what that means is when you step outside of the back of a house, a fence will need to be erected from boundary fence to boundary fence between the house and the pool. And potentially there's other treatments that may need to happen from the inside of the boundary fence. So the fence that's shared with the neighbour may well need to be made non-climbable. So potentially there's significant costs and disruption for consumers for no measurable improvement on toddler safety.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how a fence could improve safety if you've got, like, the barrier of the house as a fence, and as you've said, like, doors that close automatically. I mean, that's got to be just as good as a pool gate, just about, doesn't it?
It looks exactly right. And, what we've found, if one reads coronial inquests, as I've been doing for the last 10 years, invariably, I can't recall reading a coronial inquest where there's not been a barrier in place. I've heard of one reported, but there's always been barriers in place, and in every instance, the barrier hasn't been compliant. What we've got is a maintenance issue. The obligation of pool owners is to maintain their barriers. The pools are all handed over safe and compliant when the pool builder leaves the site, and the barriers aren't being maintained. It's mainly the gates, so the gates need to return, they need to lock. They're the main issues, but people tying gates back or putting a brick behind the gate, those issues are what bring about accidents. And they're found in the other states of Australia. If they go out every 3 or 4 years and check the barriers, the people are inclined to do the right thing, and toddlers are kept safe. So that's certainly what we're lobbying government to do, and it seems very much what government has decided to ignore.
When you say that people have to maintain the barriers, is it mainly that issue of the gates that you've spoken about, or are there other maintenance things that people would have to do to make sure that their pool enclosure stays compliant?
Yeah. Look, I guess other than the gates, the most common issues are around propping items up against barriers to allow kids to climb over the barrier. So the most common is a barbecue or swings and slides and kids' play equipment being pushed up against pool barriers and allowing kids to be able to climb over. Trees, bushes, shrubs growing up. They were small when planted, but 3 or 4 years later, the possibility of kids being able to climb up those is also possible. But as I say, largely the issue is around gates. And of the coronial inquests I've read, it's nearly always gates or kids climbing over the barriers because something's been propped up against it, or more often than not, the gate just being tied back or not closing or being permanently open. They're the issues.
Do you propose random audits to take place, or how would the inspection process work in your model, your ideal world, if you were lobbying for it?
Well, it's a reasonably lengthy process, as the other states have discovered. The first dilemma is nobody knows where all the swimming pools are in Victoria. No one knows how many there are.
Is there not a register kept of it?
There is no register.
I see.
There is no register, no, and nor has there been in the other states. And so the first thing that needs to occur is a register of all pools and spas, and that isn't something that will materialise overnight. It's something that will take a year or two to collate. In the background, we think that there should be a course developed specifically for inspectors of swimming pool barriers, as they've done in the other states of Australia. So what we're recommending is legislation be passed that immediately at sale and lease of properties with a pool or a spa, there has to be a certificate of compliance done. So commencing the day the legislation gets through, i.e. this year, and in parallel that the government works on collating a pool and spa register to collect the information on where all the pools and spas are. In parallel to that, developing a course so that people can be trained up to go out and inspect the pools, and then give people a heads up that the 3-yearly or 4-yearly inspection regime will commence as soon as that data is available. And that's generally the model they've followed in the most recent states, Queensland and New South Wales, to go through that process, and eventually you can get to a stage where there's a regular regime of inspection for pools and spas, and we will be able to improve the safety outcomes.
Well, Brendan, thank you very much for being with us this morning. Really appreciate it, and we will hopefully track this issue and see what happens, and we might catch up with you again in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Brendan Watkins there, the CEO of Swimming Pools and Spas Association of Victoria.
Mitchell's Front Page with Mitchell Dye. Mondays and Tuesdays from 9 till 11 on 94.7 The Pulse.